One of my favourite Cronenberg films, one of my favourite films from anyone, is 1991's Naked Lunch. If viewed in isolation, knowing nothing of the novel, one might find themselves alienated and put off by Naked Lunch's flat affect, intricate dense plot, and anti-intuitive narrative flow. But if viewed for a second time, still knowing nothing of the novel, if one accepts that Naked Lunch is going to be everything that it is going to be, one might find themselves feeling as though they are witnessing monumental genius. And then familiarising oneself with the text, and appreciation for this picture simply inflates, to the point wherein it becomes my quite possible second favourite of all his Cronenberg's features, behind only Videodrome. Burroughs' text is a total trip. Let me tell you a little bit about it if you're yet unfamiliar. Naked Lunch, sometimes The Naked Lunch, is a novel by William S. Burroughs originally published in 1959. The book is structured as a series of loosely connected vignettes. Burroughs stated that the chapters are intended to be read in any order. The reader follows the narration of junkie William Lee, who takes on various aliases from the US to Mexico, eventually to Tangier, and the dreamlike Interzone. The vignettes, which Burroughs called routines, are drawn from Burroughs' own experiences in these places and his addiction to drugs, heroin, morphine, and while in Tangier, Majun, a strong marijuana conviction, as well as a German opioid brand name, Eucodol, of which he wrote frequently. The novel was included in Time magazine's 100 Best English-Language Novels of 1923 to 2005. In 1991, David Cronenberg released a film of the same name based upon the novel and other Burroughs writings. The book was originally published with the title The Naked Lunch in Paris in July 1959 by Olympia Press. Because of US obscenity laws, a complete American edition by Grove Press did not follow until 1962. It was titled Naked Lunch and was substantially different from the Olympia Press edition because it was based on an earlier 1958 manuscript in Allen Ginsberg's possession. The article "the" in the title was never intended by the author but added by the editors of the Olympia Press 1959 edition. Nonetheless, The Naked Lunch remained the title used for the 1968 and 1974 Corgi Books editions, and the novel is often known by the alternative name, especially in the UK where these editions circulated. Burroughs states in his introduction that Jack Kerouac suggested the title. The title means exactly what the words say, Naked Lunch, a frozen moment when everyone sees what is on the end of every fork. In a June 1960 letter to Allen Ginsberg, Kerouac said that he was pleased that Burroughs had credited him with the title. He states that Ginsberg misread Naked Lust from the manuscript, and only he noticed that section of the manuscript later became queer, although the phrase does not appear in either of the two final texts of that novel. The rock group Steely Dan took its name from a device in this book. Upon publication, Grove Press added to the book supplementary material regarding the censorship battle, as well as an article written by Burroughs on the topic of drug addiction. In 2002, a restored text edition of Naked Lunch was published with some new and previously suppressed material added. Naked Lunch is a non-linear narrative that is difficult to describe in terms of plot. The following is a summary of some of the events in the book that could be considered the most relevant. The book begins with the adventures of William Lee, aka Lee the Agent, who is Burroughs' alter ego in the novel. His journey starts in the US, where he is fleeing the police in search of his next fix. There are short chapters here describing the different characters he travels with and meets along the way. Eventually he gets to Mexico, where he is assigned to Dr. Benway. For what, he is not told. Benway appears and he tells about his previous doings in Annexia as a total demoralizator. The story then moves to a state called Freeland, a form of limbo, where we learn of Islam Incorporated. Here some new characters are introduced, such as Clem, Carl, and Joselito. A short section then jumps in space and time to a marketplace. The black meat is sold here and compared to junk, i.e. heroin. The action then moves back to the hospital, where Benway is fully revealed as a cruel, manipulative sadist. Time and space again shifts the narrative to a location known as Interzone. Hassan, one of the notable characters of the book and a notorious liquefactionist, is throwing a violent orgy. AJ crashes the party and wreaks havoc, decapitating people and imitating a pirate. Hassan is enraged and tells AJ never to return, calling him a factualist bitch, a term which is enlarged much later when the apparently clashing political factions within Interzone are described. These include the liquefactionists, the senders, the factualists, and the divisionists, who occupy a midway position. A short descriptive section tells us of Interzone University, where a professor and his students are ridiculed. The book moves on to an orgy that AJ himself throws. The book then shifts back to the marketplace and a description of the totalitarian government of Annexia. Characters including the country clerk, Benway, Dr. Berger, Clem, and Jody are sketched through heavy dialogue and their own sub-stories. After the description of the four parties of Interzone, we are then told more stories about AJ. After briefly describing Interzone, the novel breaks down into sub-stories and heavily cut-up influenced passages. In a sudden return to what seems to be Lee's reality, two police officers, Hauser and O'Brien, catch up with Lee, who kills both of them. Lee then goes out to a street phone booth and calls for narcotics squad, saying he wants to speak to O'Brien. A Lieutenant Gonzalez on the other end of the line claims there's no one in their records called O'Brien. When Lee asks for Hauser instead, the reply is identical. Lee hangs up and goes on the run once again. The book then becomes increasingly disjointed and impressionistic, and finally simply stops. Naked Lunch is considered Burroughs' seminal work and is one of the landmark publications in the history of American literature. Extremely controversial in both its subject matter and its use of obscene language, something Burroughs recognized and intended, the book was banned in Boston and Los Angeles in the United States, and several European publishers were harassed. It was one of the more recent American books over which an obscenity trial was held. The book was banned in Boston in 1962 due to obscenity, notably child murder and acts of pedophilia, but that decision was reversed in 1966 by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. The appeals court found the book did not violate obscenity statutes, as it was found to have some social value. The hearing included testimony in support of the work by Allen Ginsberg and Norman Mailer. Sections of the manuscript are published in the spring 1958 edition of Robert Creeley's Black Mountain Review, and in the spring 1958 edition of the University of Chicago student-run publication, the Chicago Review. The student edition was not well received and caused the university administration to discuss the future censorship of the winter 1959 edition of the publication, resulting in the resignation of all but one of the editors. When the editor Paul Carroll published Big Table magazine, issue number 1, spring 1959, alongside former Chicago Review editor Irvin Rosenthal, he was found guilty of sending obscene material for the U.S. mail for including 10 episodes from Naked Lunch, a piece of writing the judicial officer for the United States Postal Service deemed undisciplined prose, far more akin to the early work of experimental adolescents than to anything of literary merit, and initially judged it as non-mailable under the provisions of 18 U.S.C. 1461. On a more specific level, Naked Lunch also protests the death penalty. In Burroughs' disposition, a testimony concerning a sickness, the Blue Movies, appearing in the vignette, AJ's Annual Party, is deemed a tract against capital punishment. Since the 1960s, numerous filmmakers considered adapting Naked Lunch for the screen. Anthony Balch, who worked with Burroughs on a number of short film projects in the 1960s, considered making a musical with Mick Jagger in the lead role, but the project fell through and the relationship soured between Balch and Jagger. Burroughs himself adapted his book for the never-made film. After Jagger dropped out, Dennis Hopper was considered for the lead role, and at one point, game show producer Chuck Barris was considered a possible financier of the project. In 1991, Canadian director David Cronenberg took up the challenge. Rather than attempting a straight adaptation, Cronenberg took a few elements from the book and combined them with elements of Burroughs' life, creating a hybrid film about the writing of the book rather than the book itself. Peter Weller starred as William Lee, the pseudonym Burroughs used when he wrote Junkie.